So in Switzerland, we don't always choose the optimal paths that are the safest to get from one point to another. And if we look at the data of what's best to do and how do we go around, well, we're going to see different means that you as clinicians can actually address the problem with your patients. This is level C, level even D evidence, because as we've seen, we don't have a lot of data, but what we do have is a lot of clinical experience. And I hope many of you will relate to what I will talk about with your own experience with your patients. And we're going to try and transfer this knowledge to your practice. And this is we're going to address 3 points. The first one is about how do you manage conflicting inspirations. The second one is how can we go about setting common grounds to create a healthy relationship with your patients and maintain it. And also the last one is about facilitating changes. I think I'm losing my microphone. There we go. So, is it a real threat? We've already had the answer this morning. Well, if I look at the news, at least in Switzerland, it is a great threat. Each time major accidents with death occurs, it usually does the head of news. And I think there is a form of stigmatization of the population. We have to account for that for our own vision of the problem. Also about the legal issues. If it happens, journalists will come after it, it will be known, we will be said as being the physician that has followed the patient and so on. And all this is a form of threat. But what's the truth? Langford and al. Did a very interesting study in 2007. What they actually did was look at the real threat either to the driver themselves or to others, and they classified by age. And what we can see by this is the standard U-shaped curve with increased risk with young age and increased with older age. What's interesting is for people that are 70 to 79, we can see an increase in death rates for the drivers themselves, but there's no increase in risk to threat to others. And then when we go to the group of 18 plus, it goes skyrocket high in the risk to themselves. And we've got a slight increase of risk towards others. And this is quite similar to the age group, 25 to 29 years old. So if we think of it, all the issue we are with this entire population, if we see it as a real threat, it's the same threat as 25 to 29 olds. I don't think we really saw ourselves as a big threat at that age. Why? Well, people become more vulnerable with age, both to injury and to death. And so when we're addressing these questions, the main victim of the situation are the patients themselves. On the other hand, well, we know if we get them off the road, indeed, they won't have accidents. Well, that's quite a good policy also to diminish accidents. Get everyone off the road, we won't have any accidents. But what happens then? This is a recent study published in 2016 with a meta-analysis. It comes across different countries and different settings, but all agree on a common point. You will increase by 2-fold the risk of depression symptoms if you have people cease driving. And this can be a major issue. So you, as clinicians, you're facing 2 different points. Is it road safety? Because I don't want my patient to become injured? Or do I have to preserve my patient from depression and keep him socially included? So now what we can think of is, should we force people to stop driving? Redlmeyer in Ontario did a great study where they actually changed the policies but monitored everyone through. And they actually tried to see what was happening with the people. And, well, reporting drivers that have health issues does indeed have positive effects. What we can see is we reduce admissions in emergency wards by 2 cases per 1,000 drivers that we have reported every year. But on the other hand, we're increasing in the same emergency wards by 4.7 times the number of admissions for depression. So we're only shifting a problem from injury to mental difficulties. What's your role in that? Maybe us as specialists and researchers, we're focused on where we see the problem. Maybe it's the point of the iceberg. This is a really interesting study done in Sweden that really acknowledges the role you have as GPs or people who actually tackle the problem. If we look at all the cases of dementia in Sweden. And look how was driving managed. What we can see is that 83% of all these patients, there was an agreement that was set between the GP and the patients. And only 9% had to be reported. So most of the work is done by agreeing and working with it. So when we develop policies, do we really have to develop all these policies on those 9% and not acknowledge all the work you do with the 83? Or should we put effort in making the best situation possible for the 83 and outreach to those 9% to maybe make them even lower to 6 or 5, or if ideally, that you never have to report patients. And this is where we're at now. So if you think of the clinical implications this has, what we need to do is try and maintain the therapeutic alliance when it's possible. And we need to focus our policies on that. And you too, when you manage a patient, thinking, how do I actually keep my patient along with me? We also need to discuss about risks. And this is in a general position. So risk to your patients, to others. And when you're discussing about risk to your patients, it's risk of injury, but also risk of social isolation. And also, we need to overcome the feeling of threat. And this is done maybe by setting common grounds. And that's the second chapter we're going to address. You have, I think, in Europe, one of the leading guidelines and efforts in addressing the problem. Maybe that's why we're addressing the topic also over here. But I think you're an example to the rest of Europe. And this simple sheet on your guideline means so much to everyone, to your patients and to you. How can you address the problem? Because it mentions responsibilities. And we're not going to go through all the small lines, but if you think about it, what are we talking about? We're talking about being sure I won't injure someone else or myself. And this is the same question that your patient has and that you have. You both have a common responsibility, trying to see whether their state of health does affect and is at risk of having them injure someone else. And both of you are together in that. And I think this is really important, to speak with patient and right from the start to make it very clear. The second point is that you're in a therapeutic relation. You want to maintain this alliance. And usually you've been trained to do a shared decision process. But when you're an expert and you have to assess fitness to drive and point out that someone has to stop driving, you don't know how to wear that suit anymore. But do you really have to get rid of it? So this is a nice study that actually tried and investigate. If we read right up the top what it means and you relate that to driving cessation, factors that facilitate an older patient's preference for an involvement in decisions about their healthcare, which also nurture trust in the GP-patient relationship. This is what you're looking for and what you're scared of losing when you're addressing fitness to drive. What it needs is a patient-centered approach. Nothing stops you from doing that when you're assessing fitness to drive. But what's even more interesting is what's on the right side, offering of expert opinion. And there we need to be clear. I'm an expert opinion in knowing what your diseases are and how it can affect your system, how it can actually relate to your life. But the patient is the expert onto how he drives because he experiences it. I have never seen him behind the wheel. So we both have a field of expertise and we can discuss about it. And once you make that clear, it becomes much easier to actually discuss it with patients. Willing to discuss uncertainties, both on their side and on yours. And this opens a whole field of being able to have common understanding and a shared decision process. What's the clinical applications? Well, both of you want to investigate and become informed. Both of you want to prevent harm. Both of you want to maintain and improve mobility. And both of you want to facilitate change. You want your patients to overcome these difficulties. They are ready to go through this, but they need help. And we're going to see that now in the third part. What's change and how is it perceived and what can we do? I think through the entire process, there are 4 steps that we're going to go through. The first is to identify needs correctly. Might sound simple, it's a bit harder than that. We need to overcome resistance. We need to discover alternatives. And we need to set goals. how am I sure that what I'm telling my patients to do is what he needs? And this can go both ways. I can have an over-anxious patient who is sure that they're having mild cognitive impairment. Maybe it's a start, but they've decided to stop. Oh, I think I'm losing my microphone again. Oop, there we go. So, and they might be not driving anymore, or really limiting their driving, and they don't need to. And they're becoming socially isolated. Maybe your work with them is to build trust in their ways of being able to drive, and maybe even push them to drive. So when we need to certify needs of change, it's about really having a clear vision of what's going on. And for that, you need to use adapted tests. And this is not about you become experts in neuropsychology. It's about being able to relate the test you're using to the function of driving and being able to talk about it. If we're using the TMT, so the trial-making task, I would go about explaining before I even start doing the test what it's all about. When you're driving, you actually need to keep your attention on different things. You're looking at your dashboards with indications, you're looking outside. You need to shift from one position to another, different functions. You also need to be able to search within your visual field of information that might appear. And this is really important for you to be able to drive. So we're going to do a test, even if it's on the paper, we were going to test these functions. And then we start the test. They can relate it to what they're going to do. They're going to accept what's going to happen. The other thing is use self-rating. Don't give them the answers. Once they've finished, ask them, did you think you did well? Look at what they tell you. Because maybe they think they did very badly when they did well, then you can use that to build trust. Or maybe they think they did perfectly well when they did badly, and then you can enter that in the discussion. And then provide feedback. Try and link the results to the experience they are having while driving. Once you have the results, don't force it down on them. We're not sure. The evidence is so weak in the relationship between these tests and what really happens on the road. Ask the questions. Well, actually, you have difficulty searching object. Do you find it difficult when you're driving around in an unknown place to find signalization or to know where you have to go? Have you noticed that? No, I haven't. Oh, yes, I have. Do you think it's related? Maybe. And lastly, confirm using a non-road evaluation. If you have suspicions, make a clear link to what happens in the ecological environment. And OTs are very well trained, and I think you've got a great system here in Ireland to be able to do this. So if we look more, and if we go past that part, and so your patient might not be fit to drive, how do we go through this? And there's some approaches that are largely inspired by the trans-theoretical model that have been developed. This is a study from Little in Australia, and one of the main points is about making the decision and owning the decision. So you've got to work through the process with the patients to help them through. Now, as with, I think today's talks will be about telling you we've got nothing under our hands to be able to really support what we say, and this is the same for the interventions that exist to actually follow patients up and help them go to other modes of transport. Overall, in the systematic review we ran last year, we only found 5 studies that had actually evaluated programs, one of which is only a protocol, so the study's underway this year. 2 of them are about group programs, and one of them was a program for vision. Now, what we can see is that overall the programs were quite promising with groups, and when we were focused under trying to find solutions with them. For the vision test, the results weren't so good. So if it's just about information and education on a specific problem, it doesn't bring a lot to patients. So now we are trying as researchers to build up interventions to help patients so that when you discover with them that maybe it's a good idea they would stop driving, they can actually find alternatives. We did a big Delphi process study with 22 experts in the field all over the world and tried to set the framework for an intervention. And I'd love to be able to tell you there, we've got it, you can use it, but it's taking more time than we would like to, but at least we've got the framework. And I just want to go through a few aspects of it which were interesting. The first of all is you have different phases that we need to address with patients and that you can do as clinicians. First, anticipation. Patients are still well off, but you see them regularly and you can talk about what criteria will they use to stop driving? What will they do once they stop driving? What would they like to already train on so that the day they have to stop driving, they're ready for it? The second part is about changing, which we saw before, which is the trans-theoretical model, and that we go through following the patient through the different phases, also going through acceptance and many of these. And the last one is the functioning or the consolidation phase, where you need to bring autonomy not only to the patients, but to the entire network. These patients are not going to go and get better. They're going to face new challenges. And through the intervention or through what you're bringing to them, they have to, with their network, have a form of autonomy in managing these difficulties. To also have trust in their future and see that it's not because I can't drive that I can't socially contribute and I'm worth something in society. And this is all about the network and the important role that can play the informal caregiver. Not in providing you information to assess fitness to drive, but in bringing you precious information on what are the solutions and how can they manage also their own life and help around with a clear insight on what normally the person they're caring for will need. Now, from the literature, what's most promising is the psychological approach of change. And the cognitive behavior therapy approach does seem to be a way to go. This is what you've been taught to use for smoking cessation, increasing physical activities. And this apparently also works for bringing changes like not driving my car anymore. And here's a few points that seem important. Understanding patients' beliefs and problems, listening to them. What do they represent? These beliefs and problems might not be the ones you see. It's about listening to them and opening and help acceptance, but also challenge their unhelpful thinking. And the last point is about setting goals. And I think we'll see that because setting goals is something that seems important. And sometimes we have patients, or we set goals way too high. Okay, you can't drive, you'll have to find other solutions. Goodbye. I mean, this is just too challenging for patients. Maybe we have to take them step by step and have them do things that are reasonable and that they can achieve. So there's different systems that exist. I like the SMART one because I can remember the name. And setting goals with your patients, or more having them set goals, is about these goals being specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So how do you relate to driving? Well, it means have them discuss of what they can do. We were thinking about, even in the initial phase, I'm going to try and use the public transport once every 2 months to see how it works. And so I get familiar with the timetables or where the bus stop is, or the fact that I must not go to the bus stop when it's raining because there's no shelter, or so on. It's also maybe later on about saying, well, how can I get organized and how can I fight against social isolation? So maybe what they will set as a goal, and you'll help them do that and facilitate this choice, saying, well, once a month, I will organize something in my house. Now I go out to see the people, or we go and play bridge at a certain place, but I'll organize a bridge in my house once a month. And this is what I'll set as a goal. And then they followed through. And most often these goals are achievable, and people can see that the change can settle in. What does the literature say about goal setting? There's moderate evidence that it actually is efficient in improving the quality of life and the self-reported emotional status. There aren't many studies around, but there's some moderate evidence of this working. And I think this is the way we're going for research, but it's also the way that if you think of what you're doing with patients, you're already most likely using, because it feels appropriate with the type of relationship you want to have with your patients. So what's the take-home message from all this, apart that we don't have any evidence? The first point is anticipation. You see your patients regularly, and often way before there's any problem. It's a great opportunity to talk about it with them and have them also set criteria or their own red flags about when it should be an issue and that you're going to dig in a bit deeper. The second point is about listening. Listening to the people's concerns about their barriers to help them overcome them. The third one is about being a facilitator of change and building that up along with the patients. When I say patients, it's sometimes with the informal caregiver. Your patients sometimes aren't able to take consistent decisions from one time to another because they have dementia, so it's difficult. And the last point is about supporting change. And then your role goes towards much more than just telling, am I fit, am I not fit to drive? And you can see that your real role as an assessor fitness to drive blends in with your role as their own physician and of the person who cares for them and follows them along. So after all, there are solutions about moving around, and we can overcome the existing gaps, even without evidence. So thank you very much for your attention.